computer. So Etsko, very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Just to kind of tell you a little bit about myself, that obviously when I was younger and more handsome and more teeth, critically, I started this business called the Schuitema Group in 1990. And the business is based on research that I conducted with a group of colleagues at an organization called the Chamber of Mines Research Organization. They no longer exist, basically because they ran out of funders. The mining industry in South Africa collapsed at the end of the 80s. But when I joined them in the early 80s, this was still a very prestigious research outfit that mainly worked in technical disciplines like ventilation and rock mechanics and explosive science, the sorts of things that would be relevant for deep level mining. But there was a lab, believe it or not, called the Human Resources Laboratory. You can imagine what we did to people there in 1980 in South Africa. Anyhow, I mean, I could get a job with them as an anthropologist. So I started doing work with this organization in the 80s. And the focus of the work was initially in the realm of conflict. I mean, as you can imagine, South Africa was going through a civil war at the time. And if you really want to understand industrial conflict and what accounted for the fact that people could get really angry or be pacified, then this is a fantastic place to kind of learn your tricks. And based on that initial research experience, there was a whole raft of content that was developed. Initially, that looked at sort of the leadership space, but eventually it's grown, touching on a number of aspects. In fact, a number of aspects that relate to the issues that you've spoken about in your introductions. So this business now we've worked. So bear in mind we've been going for 30 years now. So we have worked around the world, and we have 4 operating offices at the moment. One based here in Sweden also, but obviously the mothership is still in South Africa. And we work in just about every conceivable industry since I left the chamber in 1980, at the end of the 80s, and at the end of 89. And the core of our proposition is, what we're actually trying to argue to the world out there is that actually there's an essence of pixie dust, and it sits at the level of intent that accounts for success in every single thing that has to do with regard to people. And you can refer to it as the intent to serve. This intent to serve, first of all, addresses the problem of the fundamental problem of being a human being in a human skin. And in the face of the proximity of death, that sort of sense of fear and insecurity that we have. The issue of intent talks directly to that. And also the issue of intent also accounts for our ability to be in harmony with people around us. I mean, function in peer groups. If you look at hierarchy, leadership in organizations, and in fact, leadership in any context, this issue of the intent to give to or serve also accounts for the success of hierarchies. And finally, if you have a look at whole organizations, that actually accounts for the success of organizations. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you a thumbnail sketch insight into why the issue of intent accounts for success in every one of these realms, and particularly the intent to give or serve. So in the first instance, then, if we start off with this issue of, being in your own skin, the issue of personal excellence. I mean, fundamentally, if that's me, it's a very good portrait of me. That's me, and obviously I'm surrounded by the world, by other than me. Intent as an architecture, you can either, in any situation, you can either construct your intent in what you're getting from the world, or you can construct your intent in what you're giving to the world. And clearly they work differently. If you get something from somebody else, the thing that you're giving comes from them to you. If you give something, it leaves you for them. Now, there are really dramatic implications for these two ideas of security and fulfillment with regard to where you place your intent. If I placed my intent, if I constructed my sense of security on what I'm trying to get from the world, the question to ask is, how often does the world that you're in give you exactly what you want at that particular point in time? And the answer is actually never. So if I base my security on what I'm getting from the world, I will never be secure. Whereas if I base my security on the quality of my contribution in any situation that I'm in, because I've always got control over the quality of my contribution in the situation that I'm in, I will always be secure. In other words, the difference between being insecure and secure is not the assets, and it's not what you own, and it's not how much you've accumulated. I mean, clearly that's naive. I mean, you must have met very wealthy people in your life who were miserably insecure. I mean, there's no relationship between what you own and how secure you feel. You know, I mean, this idea that there can be enough zeros to the bank account that finally talks to the sense of emptiness that we have when we feel insecure, like a hollowness in the chest, is just nuts. I mean, there's no amount of money in the world is going to fill this hole, this emptiness called insecurity, because the hole's bottomless. It doesn't get filled by what comes from the world to you. It fills by what leaves you for the world. And you know, the asset that we seek to own that most dramatically demonstrates this is our house. And I mean, I'm discovering that this is the case also here in Sweden, as in South Africa and most parts of the world that I worked in. People have this idea, if you've paid off your house and the title deed to your house is in your own safe, in other words, you no longer owe a mortgage, you're secure. Somehow your house becomes your bastion. It becomes the thing that makes you secure. And if you ask yourself, well, what does the word security actually suggest? I mean, if something makes you secure, it kind of suggests that it'll protect you, because that's what, you know, security, things that make you secure do. They protect you. And like your house is really going to do that. I mean, you know, I mean, apart from keeping the rain and the snow off your head, I don't think it'll rush to your defense. If you arrive home this afternoon and 3 meters from your front door, a really ugly South African leapt out from behind a bush and started beating you up, I don't think your house is going to kind of throw a brick at the South African and say, hey, you can't beat him. He's my human being. I mean, in fact, there's no asset that you have that'll intervene on your behalf, that has somehow accepted a custodial responsibility with regard to you, you know. But, you know, the opposite is true. So let's assume the South African doesn't jump out from behind the bush. He actually, when you're at work, he actually invades your home. And while nobody's there, he completely trashes your house. He just, the most obscene graffiti on every wall, you know, cement in every piece of plumbing you can find, smashes every piece of glassware. And you come home this afternoon to this vandalized house. Will you be cross? And sure as hell, you'll be cross. So the question is that who's there to look after you? Are you there to look after the house, or is the house there to look after you? And clearly you're there to look after the house, which means to say that although not a single asset that you have has ever admitted any custodial responsibility with regard to you, you've accepted a custodial responsibility with regard to every one of your assets purely by claiming ownership. You don't own yourself into being secure. You own yourself into being insecure, because the more things you own, the more things can get taken away from you. Exactly the same argument has to work for this issue of contentment or fulfillment, because if I base my happiness on what I'm getting from the world, because the world rarely gives me what I want at that particular point in time, I'll stay discontented. Whereas if I base my happiness on the quality of my contribution in the situation that I'm in, because I've always got control over that, I'll always be fulfilled. Now, in other words, you have to understand that this problem of governing this issue of being a human being in a human skin is rooted in understanding how your intent operates. That the thing that we seek from life, security and fulfillment, we don't get that from the world, because we give that to ourselves, because they're the product of how our intent operates. Not only does this account for your kind of your experience of being in your own skin, it actually accounts for your relationship with others. In the first instance, your relationship with peers and teams, because, you know, you account for success in teams based on the intent of the individual to give or serve their colleague. I mean, if you think about, you know, in fact, this is true for any organization, but so think of an organization as made up of teams. That's like a ball sport. There's a task that's being done, being handed from person to person. Each one of those points of contact between two individuals on the team can either fundamentally have a collaborative character, or they can have a competitive character. They're fundamentally competitive when both of those people come into the engagement to get something out of the other person, or to win or come first. It only becomes collaborative when at least one of these people deliberately goes into the situation in order to set their colleague up to succeed. You know, most of the work that happens on the field in a professional soccer game is not about somebody scoring. It's about somebody trying to set somebody else up to score. And what this means from the point of view of the intent of the team member is that he's not saying to his colleague, I want to be the star. He's saying, I'm quite happy to make you, my colleague, the star. So this intent to serve, this intent to set your colleague up to succeed actually is pixie dust. Not only does it account for what it feels like to be in your own skin, it actually accounts for how we set up constructive teams. The next issue then is, well, what does this intent to serve mean for hierarchy? What does it mean for the idea of leadership? And you know, this is probably one of the most profound immediate implications, because, you know, we do this for literally for decades now. We ask people, what does it mean to be in charge? What does the word leadership mean? So what you have here is a list of things that got raised by a group of people who are part of a group that I trained previously. And you can sort of, there's inside this list, there's two variables. First of all, there's people. You know, it's being an example to others, setting people up for success. And then there's an idea of outcomes, you know, basically sort of creating a vision, directing people. So probably the word that most, or the sentence in this particular that most holds how most people view the issue of leadership is this idea that leadership is about directing people towards achieving a result. Another way of framing that is to say leadership is about achieving a result through people. This is true in terms of my experience of how 90% of people in leadership positions view their role. They say, my job is to achieve a result through people. Now, folks, there's an intent problem in that statement. Because if you consider this issue from the point of intent, in fact, the way to explore this issue is to do a bit of a thought experiment. To say, well, you know, let's try and account for the difference between the kind of boss that somebody would work for because they had to, and the boss that somebody would work for because they wanted to. So I'd like you to assume that you're the boss and you've got two subordinates, and that you're also an older person like myself, because otherwise the scenario isn't going to work. So your first interaction is with Fred, and you say to Fred, we assume that you're knowledgeable in the job that Fred has to do. So you're not just being nasty. Fred, in 1980, I did what you have to do now and what I did work. Don't argue with me, Fred, shut up, go do what I did. You say to Joe, in 1980, I did what you have to do now and what I did work. It may be helpful to take a look at it. Now, if the question is who's basically going to commit and kind of work because they want to, and who's going to work because he has to, then it's perfectly apparent that Fred's going to work because he has to, and Joe's going to work because he wants to. In fact, in the Fred case, you're probably going to have quite a resistant and disgruntled employee, whereas in the Joe case, you'll probably have somebody who'd be willing to make a kind of like a discretionary contribution to the business. And the question is, so what makes those two interactions different? And one can say what makes them different is that you just feel more autocratic in the Fred interaction and kind of democratic in the Joe interaction. That there's a difference in sort of like the kind of collaborative feel of your behavior. And you could say that, but I mean, that actually doesn't cut deep enough, because the problem between these two actually lies at the level of intent. And in order to interrogate the issue of intent, folks, you need to separate two variables in your mind. You need to separate means and ends. And you need to put into those two categories either the person who's doing the job or the job that's being done. So if we examine the Fred interaction, if you said to Fred in 1980, I did what you have to do and what I did work, go and do what I did, your intent is to get, your end is to get the job done. And by definition, you're using Fred, the person, as your means to get the job done. In the Joe interaction, you're doing actually something quite strange, because if you were sincere, if you meant what you said to Joe, in 1980, I did what you have to do now and what I did worked, it may be helpful to take a look at it. Surely you could have a completely different outcome from what you had in 1980. In fact, the job might, in fact, be a complete disaster. So your end in this instance isn't to get the same job done. Your end in this instance is you're actually trying to teach Joe something. Your end is the person. And what enables, what it allows you, what gives you the material to teach the person something is the job that he's doing. In other words, what's apparent once you look at this thing sharply is that under the surface, there's an inversion of means and ends. In the Fred case, you're using the person as your means to get the job done. In the Joe case, you're using the job as an opportunity to teach the person something. That inversion of means and ends tells you there's been a shift in the intent of your engagement with the subordinate. In the Fred case, your intent is to get something from him. And in the Joe case, your intent is to give him something. Now, if you describe leadership through this lens, if you said leadership is about achieving a result through people, then the question to ask is that statement consistent with the Fred interaction, or is that statement consistent with a Joe interaction? And unfortunately, that statement is consistent with the Fred interaction, because in that statement, the person, the status of the person is means, it's resource, and the aim is an outcome. So the question then is, well, what do you need to do to that statement to make that statement to be consistent with a Joe interaction? You'd clearly have to say something like leadership is about achieving people through results. And very often people look at that and say, but that doesn't even sound like English. I mean, that's just bizarre, you know? But I'd like to suggest to you that this is a very constructive way of looking at leadership. And in fact, it's exactly what a coach does with a team. So staying with our soccer analogy, you know, if the coach had this peculiar view that it was his job to achieve a result and he was going to use the players as his resources to achieve that result, then I wouldn't be surprised if the players loosened his wheel nuts or tried to sneak arsenic into his tea because of the arrogance of this, because that's not the coach's job. It's not the coach's job to achieve a result. It's the player's job to achieve a result. Now, does that mean to say the coach doesn't have a job? No, the coach does have a job. So what is his job? His job is to coach the player. Now, that doesn't mean to say that he has no interest in the game that's being played and he's got no interest in the result, because you can't coach a game if you don't know what's happening on the field and you don't know what's happening on the scoreboard. But it doesn't make those two things your job. It makes those two things your means to do your job, which is to coach the player. So the coach doesn't use the player as his means to achieve a result. He actually uses the result as his means to coach the player. A coach's product is a player. Now, you know, I mean, I've seen this over 3 decades now, folks. When this penny has dropped in the consciousness of a leadership team, when they understand their job is not to achieve a result, their job is to enable, to produce extraordinary people. And the business that they're leading is a gymnasium that allows them to cultivate extraordinary people. That business inevitably takes off. It's universally true. So what does this mean for whole organizations, and why should organizations take off under these contexts? I mean, under these conditions? In the first instance, it should stand to reason that businesses, enterprises don't exist for themselves. You know, that's what makes an enterprise different from a mafia organization. You know, enterprises are there to serve or give. There's there to serve customers or clients. And this isn't just being stupidly sentimental or kind of liberal and new agey. I mean, stands to reason. In any transaction, who's there to serve who, or what's there to serve what? Is supply there to serve demand, or is demand there to serve supply? And clearly, supply is there to serve demand. There's an onus of the intent to serve on the supply side of this transaction. That is the case, and it's true from any enterprise, from, you know, a vegetable seller in a Thai market to Saab. You know, it doesn't matter who you are. The same rule holds true. Now, what you have to understand about this collective, the intent of the organization to give or serve, is that collectives don't have intents, because a collective is an abstraction. A collective is a collection of individuals, and it's individual human beings who carry intent. So you've got to understand that this intent to give translates into how people in the organization deport themselves, and that is really, you know, if you think about an organization, it's kind of an inverted cone because there's fewer people at the top than at the bottom. But what this means in terms of how people actually behave in an organization, you know, we have a a three-baker analogy that sort of tries to account for why and how organizations succeed. And because the assumption in this is that fundamentally enterprises succeed when they produce surpluses. This is true for any enterprise, even a communist cooperative. It is when in a capitalist company, we just call the surplus a profit. But when organizations don't produce surpluses, they fail. Now, what does that mean in terms of the intent of the individuals concerned? So here we have our three bakers who collaborate to bake a cake. And as you can see, they're Swedish bakers. Those la bakers, and they work very hard at baking this cake. And at the end of the month, the cake gets sold. And each one of them takes a slice home to feed their Swedish family. And clearly, there's a slice left. What would you call the slice that's left? Well, you'd call that slice a surplus. Or if you're a capitalist, you'd call it a profit. The question is, why does that slice exist? Surely that slice only exists because the total cake that was baked was bigger than what each individual took home. In other words, the question to ask is, collectively, have these people given more than what they've taken, or have they taken more than what they've given? And clearly, they've given more than what they've taken. When you populate a group with individuals who are there to get as much as they can for giving as little as possible, you don't have a team, you don't have an enterprise, you don't have a group, you've got a herd of cats. Any organization, any group succeeds based on the degree to which the individual in the organization is willing to give, is willing to make a discretionary contribution to the organization, is actually willing to put in more than what they're getting out. The degree to which you have that is the degree to which you have success in organizations. So if you have a look at our three areas of discourse, then we argue that organizational success, the success of enterprises, is rooted in this idea of the intent of the individual to give or serve. But it should be apparent that people don't give to takers. So how this enterprise is led is a critical variable in this. Inside the problem of organizational excellence is this issue of leadership excellence. Are leaders there to achieve people through results or results through people? I mean, that's the fundamental problem here. Do leaders think they're there to produce a balance sheet or a scorecard or produce even a result in the market, or do they understand that their product is their people? Sitting inside that problem is this issue of collaboration, because teams succeed when individuals are there to set the colleagues up to succeed. And sitting inside this thing is the fundamental problem of being a human being in a human skin. How do you deal with the proximity of catastrophic failure and death? Because this is the thing that stalks us all. Actually, you deal with that thing on the basis of the same variable, the intent to give or serve. So who we are as an organization, we work in all four of those areas. And as a business, we help individuals to achieve a fundamental sense of security and fulfillment in their lives. We also help teams to succeed by enabling members to set each other up to succeed. We help leaders to empower their people with regard to care and growth. We have a leadership model that's called the care and growth model that's actually rooted in that research that I did at the Chamber of Mines in South Africa in the 80s. And then finally, we also help organizations to establish the why and the how of how they make a contribution to the world. There's a number of variables that you need to consider when you're trying to think organization, which isn't concerned with how the organization is led or how teams operate. They're technical problems. They're things like, how do you construct measures in this organization? How do you deal with control? There's a whole raft of variables that are independent of how the organization is led and how people deport themselves in teams, that are critical things that you need to address if you want to create a collective which is populated by individuals who are there to give or serve. We have a team in Sweden. We have Anna, the beautiful Anna Putar Rimhagen. She's based here in Linköping. And Susanne. We have Anna's running us, in fact, our European venture. And then we've actually had some content that we were going to do live events for. but they've all been cancelled because the Swedes all become diseased with COVID. It's terrible. Anyhow, so we had a 24-hour kind of session that we had planned that would be sort of quite an intense introduction to the care and growth content. That's now been replaced as a kind of like a 1-hour webinar taster, and that's on the 24th of November. We also had an introduction to the care and growth leadership model. We're also going to replace that with a 1-hour webinar. And you know, this is, if you interested in what we do and who we are, please do have a look at our business at schuitemagroup.com. And thank you very much. I've abused my half hour.
Amen.
No, you have not, Etsko. Thank you very much. I open up the floor for questions to Etsko.
I wonder, I mean, as you've been working with this so long, since the 80s, how has the world changed during these 40 years? Have you seen it become more giving, so to say?
I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I think I'm too small a datum point of observation to make a call on the whole planet. So I don't know. I can say I'm finding it easier to sell the message. There might be a number of reasons for that, though. I mean, not necessarily that the world is more ready. I mean, it might just be that we're more eloquent as a team because we've been exercising the same arguments over and over. And also, I did come from a very sort of dysfunctional place. I mean, South Africa in the 80s, I mean, you can imagine what it was like trying to sell this idea of the intent to serve to a group of deep level miners in 1990. I mean, they thought I was mad. I mean, you know, so the fact that we still have a business has to mean that there was some divine intervention somewhere. You know, otherwise we couldn't have had this business. So I'm finding it easier to sell the work. I'm not entirely sure that the world has changed, but you know, maybe the world has changed.
Maybe some parts of it. Obviously, not the whole world, but maybe some parts.
Well, I think so. What are my datum points for saying that? You know, the world that I grew up in was far more tolerant of brutality and violence than the world that I'm in now. I am 62 years old. Things are changing, but there's definitely a shift. I mean, just the fact that you could be sitting anywhere on the planet and we could be having this conversation now. That's saying we're connecting as human beings in ways we've never done before. And that means, I think, for the work that we're doing now, this is an immense opportunity because people are looking for something that could serve as a universal foundation to find each other from. And certainly the intent thematic can do that.
Okay, any more question to Etsko?
Another reflection. Have you heard about the Mind Shift conference on Friday from Stefan?
No.
I think that would be interesting for you to participate in.
I can send you the links, Etsko.
Thank you.
I haven't, sorry.
Go ahead, Madeleine.
I haven't a question, but I just would like to say to you that you spoke right into my heart.
Thank you, Madeleine. Yeah. That's very generous of you.
I'm thinking about from a company perspective, and if you see that you have this command and control leadership in the company, how could you act as middle management or as do you need to wait for top managers to adhere to this new type of thinking? What's your experience?
Stefan, there's apparently simple question is actually very complex, the one you're raising, because there's a number of variables at issue. First of all, if you say, well, what should the leader give to their subordinates? You know, I mean, if you say you're here not here just to produce a result, you're here to give, what should you give? A way to kind of populate that question is to just take a piece of paper and write down the attributes of a boss that you would work for because you really wanted to. And people can do that. And I mean, you know, have a whole list of attributes. And eventually you can have like 50 attributes. And then you can ask yourself, is there anything on this list that you couldn't personally do for an immediate subordinate? And there wouldn't be one. And that wouldn't matter of what the organization is in. So in the first instance, I mean, this entire approach is deeply affirming of the role of the individual. The collective does not define the individual defines the collective. And it doesn't matter where you are in the hierarchy. You're not under the thumb of the rogue or the brutalizers, you know. In any situation, you can either construct your engagement in the situation and what they're doing to you or what you're giving. That autonomy they can never take away from you. I mean, that's what Viktor Frankl discovered in a concentration camp. They can never take away the meaning that you designate to something or the intent that you have in a moment. So anybody can do this. The second question, though, is, and I mean, this might be a little bit more politically contentious, and I'm pleased that we're not sitting in the same room so you couldn't throw something at me. But who's to say that command and control is the problem? Because so can I tell you a story that really taught me a lot about this? And that happened a long time ago in the 80s. The research methodology that I followed for most of the 80s, wasn't all of them, but the research methodology that I followed in the 80s was really to conduct surveys of the climate of employee opinion on mines. And I came across a man in 1987 on a mine called Valries West. This was a big mine at the time. They employed about 44,000 people. And on a number of shafts. The particular shaft that I was working on was 5 shaft. And this mine overseer's name was Corrie Stuchling. Now, this guy was a big guy. I mean, he was working with the Vikings. I mean, this guy must have have Viking ancestry because he was huge. He had like a head taller than me. And when I say big, I mean, he didn't have an ounce of fat in him. It was just ripped muscle. You know, he had like hands like spades, this guy, and multiple black belts in karate. He was a mean piece of work. I mean, it was just a scary piece of work, this guy. And he had the most horrifying reputation for assaulting people underground, you know. He actually used to hit people at work. Now, but now just understand the historical context. This is South Africa in the 80s, right? So there's a low-level civil war going on. The union, the National Union of Mine Workers, is quietly busy crucifying every second management team in the industry. So when news of this Neanderthal, who was still slapping people around underground, got to the head office of the company, Anglo Gold, in Johannesburg, they were completely scandalized. They said, "Oh, you can't do this anymore. You can't hit people at work, you know, anymore." So they were really horrified, and they said they sent an instruction down to the mine concern, to Valries. They said, "We don't care what you do to this guy, this Corrie Stuchling. We can't afford to have him on our team. The union is going to crucify us. Fire him." Now, this was quite a shocking kind of announcement to the management team of Valries, because this man, this Corrie Stuchling, was one of the best mine overseers on the whole complex. So they were really, what are we going to do about this? A big debate. They finally decided they won't fire him. They'd get him out of a production role. They'd give him a planning role. The idea being that if he's behind a planning table and he didn't have people reporting to him, maybe he wouldn't hit so many people, So that's what they did. They took the guy out of a production job. They gave him a planning job. And his entire crew had a big section of about 1,000 men. His entire crew of 1,000 men went on strike. They wanted their mine overseer back. You couldn't believe the confusion in the rest of that business. What's wrong with these people? They like to get assaulted. Management, first of all, trying to hold the line, but then it became apparent that they would have to buckle. So they put the guy back in his job, but nobody understood what was going on here. And actually, the answer to this came sometime later when there was a very serious fall of ground in this guy's section, you know? And guess who was the last guy out the section? It was this guy. It was Corrie Stichler, you know? And now you know why his men trusted him, because he was genuinely there for them, not just cosmetically there for them. So the problem with our discourse around political correctness is that it ends us up in a very superficial discussion about behaving nice. People don't want nice behavior, they want sincerity. If we go back to our coaching example, good coaches are very often not very nice people. I mean, if a coach is passionate enough to make the best in you possible, they're not going to take nonsense from you because they want the best for you. They want you to be exceptional. You know, so I think we've come as far as we can with this issue of political correctness and kind of this egalitarian thinking. We need a new way of looking at things that goes deeper, that isn't just stuck on a behavioral level.
Okay.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much. Now Marie is waving. Is it to leave the meeting or? And then I think we say thank you very much, Etsko. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Very nice meeting you all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All the best.